and Transport Infrastructure and Communities. Today's meeting has taken place in a hybrid format, no different than the way we've been for some time now. And this is pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are all aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few points to follow. I don't like calling them rules. They're just, I guess, for the lack of a better word, recommendations from the House. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the directives from the Board of Internal Economy regarding masking and health protocols. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the proceedings and verification officer. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed to the chair. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to a speaking list, as always, the committee clerk, as well as myself, will do the best we can to maintain the order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. So members, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, October 29th, 2020, the committee is meeting today to continue its study on the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Now I would like to welcome our witnesses. We have Concert Infrastructure, Darren Bain, Managing Director, as well as the Council of Canadians, Dylan Penner, Climate and Social Justice Campaigner. With that, gentlemen, I'm not sure who's going to go first. I guess we'll point at Mr. Bain to go first. You have 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you to contribute to your study of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. Concert Infrastructure is an independent long-term investor, developer, and manager of public infrastructure. Our foundation and strength include the backing of Canadians represented by the 10 union, including building trades, and management pension plans that are our shareholders. Concert Infrastructure was created to invest in Canadian public-private partnership or P3 infrastructure projects, strengthening communities while providing stable and predictable financial returns for our shareholders. This Canadian-centric infrastructure investment model seeks to secure the long-term financial future or retirement income of Canadians while partnering with Canadian companies and employing Canadian building trade workers to deliver critical public infrastructure. Through 10 direct infrastructure investments, with an aggregate capitalization of almost $3 billion, including the Iqaluit International Airport, several school bundles, and the BC Children and Women Hospital projects, Concert has been a successful vehicle enabling pension plans access to Canadian infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is critical to strengthening the economic and social fabric of Canadian communities. It is well understood that Canada, like most nations, faces a massive infrastructure deficit. Concert supports the government initiative to address this deficit through the Investing in Canada plan and its $180 billion financial commitment. We also agree with the government and the CIB objective to leverage private sector investment in infrastructure to deliver more projects more quickly. In late 2016 and early 2017, Concert engaged directly with the government on its CIB initiative. At the time, we were assured that the initiative would not impact the well-established, competitive, and successful Canadian P3 model and sector. Today, our position and message to the committee on the CIB remains consistent. P3s have been successfully implemented across Canada for almost 20 years, including British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, and Nunavut. It is a model that delivers infrastructure in partnership with all levels of government and agencies on time and on budget. The Canadian P3 model is widely viewed as best in class, and many Canadian companies are now exporting the model to other countries. Canada continues to underutilize the model and expertise, particularly the federal government. Too few federal government-led projects are brought to market. There is an abundance of private capital available for infrastructure investment in Canada, but an undersupply of project opportunities. Canadian capital is available and waiting to invest in our infrastructure. Canadian institutional investors such as pension plans have the experience, track record, and success, as well as the capital available to invest in these projects. Similarly, the First Nations Financing Authority exists in Canada to provide third-party financing to Indigenous infrastructure projects. The Canadian P3 market is competitive and mature, resulting in efficient pricing, development, delivery, and management of public infrastructure projects, often led by Canadian institutional investors such as Concert. A primary role of the CIB should be to expedite and package the wide range of sizable infrastructure projects in a way that is accessible and relies on these pools of private sector capital. The activity of the CIB to date appears to crowd out opportunity for private sector equity and debt investment in infrastructure projects. The November 2020 CIB Corporate Plan, Appendix I, page 80, lays out various infrastructure delivery models and structures, making it clear that the CIB intends to finance design, build, finance, maintain, or DBFM projects, or design, build, finance, operate, maintain, DBFOM projects that have been previously financed by Canadian institutional investors. There are three main CIB priorities that Concert recommends that this committee include in its final report. First, leverage private sector investment, structuring projects to maximize private sector equity and debt. CIB should not be financing P3, DBFM, or DBFOM projects. It should respect its mandate of supporting revenue usage risk infrastructure projects. Second, the CIB should be mandated to take a leadership role in the identification and implementation of major federal government infrastructure projects while seeking to maximize private sector equity and debt investment. This activity will produce a greater pipeline of investable projects. An inventory of CIB projects and opportunities for private investment should be maintained and be transparent to the Canadian infrastructure market. A mandatory federal P3 screen of projects should be reinstated, supporting greater private sector investment in infrastructure. Finally, the CIB should be separated from routine government decision-making, giving it a clear mandate to support the implementation and delivery of infrastructure projects. As you work to develop your report, we urge you to be mindful of the existing successful Canadian infrastructure investment market and how the CIB is impacting this market and ultimately the effective and efficient delivery of infrastructure in Canadian communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. We'll now move on to our next speaker. Mr. Penner, it's all yours.
Thank you for the invitation to join this important discussion. Using the Canada Infrastructure Bank to advance infrastructure privatization and public-private partnerships is deeply misguided and dangerous, and here's why. The CIB's current structure promotes a flawed financing model of public-private partnerships, inviting and subsidizing private interests to take control of critical infrastructure and services that should be kept in public hands. P3s are a tool that poorly invests public funds to further corporate interests while failing to support communities. The CIB could play a critical role in supporting a just recovery from the pandemic and support the transition to a low carbon economy, but not if it remains fixated on privatization and P3s. For infrastructure to truly be in the public interest, it must be publicly owned and operated. P3s eliminate jobs, lack transparency, and exclude municipalities from the decision-making process. Given the failings of P3s, we should not be surprised that at least one CIB project has already been cancelled before it even began. Last summer, the township of Mapleton called off its plans to privatize its water infrastructure with the CIB because the privatization would have been too risky for the township. And P3s cost more. Canadians could benefit from the CIB if it were returned to its original mandate. A federal provider of low-cost public financing for infrastructure projects would help municipalities from coast to coast to coast. The current CIB model, however, which relies on private financing, often provides municipalities with loans 2 to 3 times higher interest rates compared to public borrowing, and requires financiers to provide a return on investment for their shareholders. This results in significantly higher project costs with no added benefit for municipalities. And contrary to what some might view the situation as, in a review of 74 public-private partnerships in Ontario in 2014, the Auditor General concluded that they cost the province $8 billion more than if they had been procured publicly. A similar report by the BC Auditor General suggested the 16 P3 projects cost the province nearly twice as much compared to public financing. The Ontario and BC governments wasted billions of public dollars. Trees deliver less, and this in a time when the climate crisis requires us to move quickly to decarbonize everything, including infrastructure. Publicly owned and operated infrastructure delivers more quickly than P3s, which are prone to failures and delays. In an attempt to cut corners and maximize profits, private companies operating P3s often try to reduce their workforce and avoid, quote, unnecessary investments in the public interest, delivering poorer quality. And the business case for P3s often includes a significant risk transfer amount, presumably as the private sector takes on the risks associated with the project. However, the Ontario Auditor General has reported that this risk transfer factor in P3 projects is regularly inflated without evidence, often to favor the P3 option. So when it comes to essential services like water, sewage treatment, or transit, the community and municipalities still bear the consequences and higher costs when things go wrong. P3s lack accountability and remove community control. Governments need the flexibility that comes with public infrastructure financing in order to enact strategic industrial policy. Hiding behind confidential contracts, the entire process of negotiating and procurement of P3s is behind closed doors. The contract, once signed, takes away public control of the infrastructure and services, undermining that needed flexibility for several decades. In March 2018, for example, Ottawa City Councillors had only 3 weeks to review their P3 contract for the stage 2 of the light rail transit here before signing. They did not learn until after the fact that the winning consortium failed to meet the minimum technical score. In 2011, Berlin. Yes?
1 minute.
Berlin. Sorry?
1 minute.
Oh, 1 minute. Thank you. In 2011, Berlin residents and citizen groups had to push for a referendum to publicize the contract for its privatized water services before ending up taking it back into public hands. P3s were a poor model before the pandemic, and now that we have the opportunity to build back better, P3s should play no role in Canada's post-COVID recovery plan. Canadians need a just recovery plan that puts communities ahead of profits, ahead of corporate profits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Penner, and thank you, Mr. Bain, to both of you. Well done. We're now going to move on to our first round of questions. We're going to start off with the Conservative Party, Mr. Scheer, followed by the Liberal Party, Mr. Sadu, Bloc Québécois, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, and the NDP, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Scheer, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd first of all like to thank our witnesses for two very articulate, if perhaps polar opposite presentations, but I certainly do appreciate both of you sharing your perspectives. If I could ask Mr. Bain a very quick question. I was trying to take down notes as you were speaking. Could you just go over your first recommendation about your recommendation for the committee about leveraging private sector investment and what you think the CIB needs to shift to accomplish that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So the first recommendation was really around a focus on indeed doing, just as you've laid out, leveraging private sector investment in these infrastructure projects. I think that's been a clear and consistent mandate of the CIB since its inception in 2017 and confirmed a number of times over the last 3 years or so as it's kind of gone through a series of major announcements and adjustments. By that, I think the point that I would be making with respect to this is, to date, I think the track record of the CIB and the announcements are really around federal commitments to fund certain projects that are laid out on its website. Given that this is an actual performance metric that is laid out in the CIB's corporate plan, I think it's important going forward that some focus and emphasis be placed on the amount of private sector investment that these commitments are intended to raise alongside the government funding.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's a key point, because this was the main thrust when the infrastructure bank was announced. It was that the prime minister had gone off and attended some very fancy parties and spoke to some very very well-connected financiers around the world, and he came back with this idea that there was all this untapped capital waiting, just looking to invest in places, and if the government could provide just a little bit of grease on the wheels, or de-risk it a little bit, they would be tripping over each other to come and invest and build out the types of infrastructure needs that our communities needs. Here we are. I mean, it was announced in 2016. It's been up and running now for almost 4 years. We're just shy of the 4-year anniversary. To date, they've completed no projects. So in your view, as it currently exists, has the bank been successful in leveraging that private sector money?
Mr. Bain?
I think, yeah, as I sort of responded earlier, I think the thing to recognize about infrastructure is that it does take time to plan, to procure, to approve, and to finance and to mobilize. So, insofar as these commitments that have been made to date ultimately lead to a project, I think that's a positive thing in terms of what we're trying to achieve and what countries want to achieve through infrastructure investment. But again, I think, the CIB itself has laid out the objective on a number of times, and as I said, in its formal corporate plan, that it's going to be measured. I think the corporate plan lays out a 2 times multiple of CIB capital from the private sector. And I think it's fair to say at this point in time, I'm not sure that any private capital has been committed alongside those project commitments.
Sure.
Fair enough. I can speak to you referenced some of the old the previous government's P3 model, which was of course very successful. I have a project in my own riding that within a 4-year time frame, the commitment was made, and the overpasses on the highway were built. So there certainly is a track record of the previous government of getting these types of projects built quickly through the P3 system. Your second recommendation was that the CIB should do more in terms of identifying large-scale projects where the federal government could play a role. Am I to understand what you mean by that is they should be more proactive? Are they, up till now, have they been kind of too passive, waiting for kind of applications to come onto their desk? Is the recommendation there that they should work with the other levels of government to identify potential projects that may not have reached the stage of a formal bid?
Mr. Bain?
It is my understanding that within the federal government, there is no single agency that's responsible for the coordination, the approval, the implementation of federal infrastructure projects. Each federal department retains that responsibility on their own to deliver the projects within their department. I do believe, as per my second recommendation, that if the CIB were given a mandate to screen, say, all federal government projects or capital commitments above $100 million, similar to the previous P3 screen that was in place prior to 2015, that it could generate significant opportunities to attract private sector capital to the federal government's own stock of projects and infrastructure that it has to deliver, whether that's First Nation housing or building infrastructure, RCMP, DFO, Coast Guard, CBSA facilities, military housing and D&D building infrastructure, government land, buildings and office space, government labs. Again, with that type of a private sector investment screen on major federal government commitments, to me, that would generate more investment and more project opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Mr. Scheer. We're now going to move on to the Liberal Party. Mr. Sidhu, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to, I think it's popping. Thank you, Chair, and to our witnesses for joining us today. Brampton is a growing and vibrant city, and advocating for a city where I grew up and now raising my own children is extremely important to me. The recent $45 million Brampton Transit investment will help our residents with more viable transport options while reducing our carbon footprint. The Brampton River Rock project, which received close to $40 million from the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, will help mitigate flooding while unlocking economic potential to create job opportunities. Now, as Brampton Liberal MPs continue to advocate for Brampton, I know sustainability is top of mind. Mr. Bain, the Government of Canada is not the only country mobilizing the use of partnerships to sustainably finance critical infrastructure projects. For example, the Nordic Investment Bank and the European Investment Bank use similar models. I believe other countries such as the UK are looking to create an infrastructure bank. Can you speak to some international best practices and what other creative financing options other countries are using to finance critical infrastructure projects?
Mr. Bain.
Thank you for the question. As you pointed out, there are a number of examples of various jurisdictions that are pursuing models to increase or leverage private sector investment in infrastructure. Most recently, I believe the UK is looking at a potential infrastructure bank to make its infrastructure investments. Obviously, there's a significant track record of P3 models around the world, whether Australia, the UK, Canada, the United States. I think what I would say on this point is, there's certainly no disagreement with the objective of investing in infrastructure and its impact on jobs, productivity, and growth in a modern economy. Really, I think the point that I've been making is the CIB set out a specific mandate with respect to attracting private sector capital and leveraging private sector capital. And I think we just need to make sure that that remains a focus and that it delivers on that.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bain. And Mr. Bain, our government is committed to fighting climate change and exceeding our 2030 emissions targets. The Canada Infrastructure Bank Growth Plan is looking to support clean power, zero-emission buses, and energy-efficient infrastructure. Can you speak to the types of infrastructure investments that will help accelerate these goals?
Mr. Bain.
I think there's a number of potential sectors that would help with that goal. I think it's important to note that really with any infrastructure project that's been delivered in recent memory, in my experience through the P3 model, they all seek to maximize sustainability objectives and ensure that they're considering climate change and that those impacts. So obviously investments in renewable energy can help achieve that goal. Yeah, that's what I would say in response to that.
Just to do.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Appreciate your insights. And the Canada Infrastructure Bank recently announced a partnership with the government of Alberta to help build a modern irrigation system that will enhance crop production while providing water security and mitigate the impacts on the environment. Our government is committed to supporting innovative projects across the country like Alberta irrigation that will bring us into the future and provide significant returns on investment. Can you emphasize or speak to the new innovations that the Canada Infrastructure Bank should consider supporting? It's similar to my last question, but just more in depth.
Mr. Bain.
Can you maybe, be a little more specific what you're trying to get at?
Well, the Canada Infrastructure Bank can be used for many different type of projects. So I'm just thinking of taking an innovative approach. What are your thoughts on that,
Mr. Bain?
Well, I think if you look at the list of projects that it's committed to, whether it's the one you cite in terms of Alberta irrigation, whether it's Lulu Island District Energy, whether it's the Oneida Energy Storage Project. Those are all obviously Pirate Harbor Wind Farm. That's a basket of projects clearly that lands in the kind of renewable energy space. And I think, that's certainly a priority for this government. And it's clearly a priority for many others as we sort of face the challenges of climate change.
Mr. Sadu.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Penner, I'll just come to you. How do you think the government, when we consider projects and we talk about the broader impacts on the community that come with these projects, how do you think the government should approach this?
Mr. Penner.
Well, fundamentally, it comes back to the mandate of the bank itself and the importance of returning it to public financing and moving away from engaging in support for privatization and P3s, as I outlined just some of the challenges with P3s earlier. I find it interesting that often folks who speak in favor of P3s use rhetoric that seems very detached from the evidence. There's been, as I mentioned, reports from attorneys general that outline just how wildly these projects overspend, and it's well documented how much longer they take, how much more they cost, how local councils and local governments lose democratic oversight of the projects themselves that would be there if they were public projects. So it's in many ways not a question of individual projects, but it comes back down to the mandate needing to be for public projects, publicly funded, publicly financed, and operated.
Thank you, Mr. Penner, and thank you, Mr. Sadu. We're now going to move over to the block. Mr. Brassou-Duval, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps I could begin with Mr. Bain. In your opening statement, you referred to independence of institutions such as the Canada Infrastructure Bank compared to government, or vis-à-vis the government, rather. Do you believe that currently you're seeing that there is a lack of independence between these two?
Bain?
Thank you for the question. I think, not being directly involved in the specific business of the bank, there's certainly been observations and reports from the outset that the board of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank did not have the requisite autonomy and authority to actually deliver the projects. My understanding is that in the October 2020 announcement around their $10 billion growth plan, it's my understanding that perhaps some of the requisite authority autonomy has now been clarified for the board of the CIB, and it will have the responsibility to actually see these projects delivered and advanced without interference moving forward.
Brassou-Duval?
Do you not find that it's a bit of a strange beast, that is the Canada Infrastructure Bank? That is, you've added on a bureaucratic level, you've added more civil services offices to distribute federal money, which could be distributed through regular programs, for example, infrastructure projects, rather they're being hand-tied in funding infrastructure in a certain way. And as is a means of providing the private sector with additional profits.
Mr. Bain?
What I would say in response to that is that there's obviously different vehicles for financing infrastructure and its delivery. Certainly a granting approach is one approach. Provincial agencies that have been set up in the provinces, whether Ontario, BC, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and even in the province of Quebec, that were mandated with delivery of the P3 model is another approach. I think that the CIB model can certainly work. It's a viable approach, but again, I go back to the point that I've sort of tried to highlight is, as part of the CIB's mandate, as part of its core mandate, it's laid out that it is to leverage and maximize private sector capital investment, as I said, to a 2x multiple of CIB's funding commitment. So I think that's the accountability and the focus with respect to the performance and the success of the agency moving forward.
Mr. Brassou-Duval?
Mr. Duval? Well, I began by saying that I have yet to be convinced of the so-called amazing efficiency of the private sector compared to the public sector. when it comes to using capital. And I'd like you to say a bit more about this, Mr. Baines. That is, how will this magic in the private sector occur if these projects are actually launched? And how much better is it than the public sector?
Bain?
Yeah, I don't think there's a magic to this. I think there is a successful track record, whether it be in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Quebec, Nunavut, whereby the P3 model, with the private sector taking responsibility for these projects, has resulted in significant cost savings and schedule benefits to those governments that have implemented the approach.
Mr. Penner earlier mentioned that the Ontario Auditor General mentioned some 74 projects, PPP, had cost $8 billion more than if they had been led by the public sector. Does that not in a certain way contradict what you've just said?
Mr. Bain?
My understanding, that report made certain assumptions around risk transfer and value for money analysis that was arguable. Just insofar as we can quote reports such as that, I can look to Concert Infrastructure's experience with this model in Saskatchewan, where it was used to deliver 2 bundles of schools, 18 schools, the largest Saskatchewan school building project in the province's history, and it generated savings in that instance of upwards of $100 million. I think it's important to also think about broader public policy interests and objectives when you're looking at this model. As I laid out in my opening, Concert Infrastructure is owned by 10 management and union pension plans in British Columbia. These investments in the infrastructure not only being delivered on time and on budget, but they're also supporting the long-term financial security of Canadian workers that are members of these pension plans.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Mr. Barceau-Duval. We're now going to move on to the NDP. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for appearing today. I'm trying to decide where to start in on this. This has been very interesting listening to the testimony from both of you. Perhaps I'll start with Mr. Penner. Trying to boil these issues down to simple concepts. We recently learned that some of the projects funded by the Canada Infrastructure Bank are going to be allowed to charge users to generate profits for their corporate operators. And these projects are also receiving essentially low interest loans through the CIB. So the Canadian public is providing inexpensive financing and then is having to pay again through user fees once the projects are constructed. I'm assuming based on your opening comments that you don't feel this is appropriate. I wonder if you could expand a bit on why.
Mr. Penner?
Thanks for that. And this is a classic problem with public-private partnerships. When essential infrastructure or services are privately operated, there is also this incentive to bring in or increase user fees over time to create profit. And plans for user fees, as you mentioned, have been confirmed by the CIB itself in its last annual report. Just to give you one example from the U.S., a Food and Water Watch report showed that in the U.S., private sector providers charge 59% more for drinking water and 63% more for sewage services than public water services. And rising user fees affect the most vulnerable communities first, and in the case of water, could violate the human right to water. So I could go on in terms of other sectors, but I think that just highlights the seriousness when it comes to user fees of just one of the many problems with P3s.
Mr. Bachrach?
Thank you, Mr. Penner. I come from a local government background. I was the mayor of a small community, and I took great interest in the story of Mapleton. I know that you followed this very closely, and I wonder if you could share with the committee some of the lessons that were learned through that experience and how the conversation between the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the local government unfolded over the months involved in those discussions.
Mr. Penner.
Thanks for that. Well, I think the short version is, as I mentioned it, that the council recognized the very serious risks that some of which I highlighted when it comes to P3s, and that's why they in the end opted to go public. And I want to put this in context too, because while Mapleton is one important example and it's very connected to the CIB. This is happening in the context where there's a global movement that at the council we're proud to be part of, aimed at taking back public control of water that now consists of 267 municipalities in 37 countries. So it's not just Mapleton. This is a widespread move that is happening of remunicipalization because people and communities and councils are recognizing just how bad water P3s are for their community. Another really important example to look at is Hamilton and Ontario, which signed a 10-year P3 deal in 1998 for their water systems. And soon after, residents woke up to 135 million liters of raw sewage spilling into the harbor and flooded basements and businesses. Hamilton's water service workforce was cut in half, which I think is just one of many examples that highlights that P3s aren't about job creation and actually lead to job cuts. And Project Cost Balloon and the water contract changed hands 4 times. So there is a lot to look at in terms of why going down this road is a very bad idea.
Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Penner, Waterton, or Mapleton rather, is a very small community. I come from a small community. A lot of the projects that we talk about when we talk about P3s and when we talk about the Canada Infrastructure Bank are huge communities, municipalities, urban areas, and projects that range in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Is there a risk here that the emphasis and the focus of government is going to shift onto projects that are the most profitable, where corporations stand to make the most profit? And what are the risks for smaller communities in terms of the equity between municipalities and local governments of different sizes in our country?
Mr. Penner.
Well, I think part of it's an important question, and I think part of it is also asking who are these projects profitable for? Certainly not for the local communities, as we've seen from the reports from the auditors general, and I think for me, I live in Ottawa, and for those people who don't live in Ottawa, you might not know that for quite some time, the P3 for the light rail transit here was basically the bad punchline for pretty much everyone in Ottawa because of the lack of accountability and democratic oversight, because of the cost overruns, because of the fact that it took well over a year past deadline to move forward at stage 2. So, just one example of a very problematic P3 in a slightly larger community. So it really comes down to how these projects aren't in the interest of people or communities, but serve to increase corporate profits.
Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The $10 billion growth plan funded through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, one of the stated aims of the growth plan is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Do you feel that the CIB is the best mechanism to deliver on that particular objective of meeting our climate targets? I know we've had some discussion of this already, but perhaps you could provide your thoughts.
Mr. Penner.
I think not, if it's continuing down the road of P3s and privatization. What we need to keep in mind is fundamentally privatization isn't part of the solution. It's a central part of the problem. And the deeper problem is neoliberalism, which is that toxic mix of privatization, yes, but also deregulation, so-called free trade, that has devastated communities, and that despite what proponents claim, none of these are about jobs or private interests, but about corporate profits and making the rich richer. And the neoliberal policies of the last several decades have locked us into the escalated nature of the climate crisis we've faced, and including dispossessing and marginalizing the most vulnerable people and plundering our resources and putting our public health at risk for profit of a wealthy few. And the pandemic has really laid bare the damages of decades of gutted public services and focus.
Thank you, Mr. Penner. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. We're now going to move on to our second round. Our second round is for 5 minutes and 2.5 minutes each for the NDP and the Bloc. We're going to start off with the Conservatives. Ms. Cusi, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be passing my time back to Mr. Scheer. Thank you.
Mr. Scheer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And yeah, we tried to get a message to the clerk there, but thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Penner, because last time most of my questions were for Mr. Bain. Just wanted, I'm probably not going to change your opinion on the benefits of private sector investment and some of the growth and project reduction costs, and you're probably not going to convince me. We won't change each other's mind, but I'm hoping we can find one area of common ground, and that is that if the government is going to allow for private sector involvement in these projects, would you not agree that risk and reward should go together? In other words, if the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is going to operate in such a way as to guarantee financing, as to provide backstop on the loans, or lower borrowing costs to the benefit of corporations, private sector involvement in that surely to goodness the risk should go with the reward. If we're going to allow these companies to earn profits off of public infrastructure, that they should bear the risk that comes along with that.
Mr. Penner?
Well, the problem is that they don't. What happens is the private sector gets the reward and the communities bear the risk. What we've seen in our fundamentally unjust system, just to look at the pandemic, billionaires have gained $3.9 trillion and workers have lost $3.7 trillion globally during the pandemic. And this historic transfer of wealth to the 1% is an indictment of this neoliberal model that privatization is a key part of. And so more privatization isn't building back better, it's just building back more of the same that got us into these problems in the first place.
Well, you and I will absolutely agree that the current Liberal government is certainly allowing a certain class of Canadian to benefit off the pandemic. And when you look at some of the information coming out of the Bank of Canada and where some of the asset growth has been, but we're kind of talking narrowly about the CIB, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, and its model. And one of our criticisms of the bank, and again, I know you and I aren't going to agree on the fundamental principle of whether or not private sector corporations should be able to participate in these types of projects, but I'm hoping that you and I can agree that even though we come from different perspectives philosophically, that at the very least, if you're going to allow profits to be made on large scale public infrastructure, the risk should come with that the business model where the Canadian Infrastructure Bank underwrites these types of projects, assuming the risk for taxpayers while guaranteeing profits for private sector. In other words, if the private sector knows that at the end of the day, the bank will be on the hook and therefore paying taxpayers, I'm hoping that you and I could find that common ground. Even though we might start from different philosophical positions, we might agree that at the very least, risk and reward should go together.
Mr. Penner?
Well, I don't agree with the premise that the CIB continuing down the road of privatization and P3s is a foregone conclusion. When the idea was originally announced, it was rooted in public financing, and it could and should be again. And as some of the evidence I shared today has highlighted, and there's plenty more out there from many reputable organizations. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has written in depth on this, as well as the Auditor Generals that I mentioned, that we need to go in a different direction and not put communities on the hook for these problematic privatized projects.
Sure.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll go back to Mr. Bain then. In your experience, based on the conversations you've had with your partners and your members and the people that you represent and work with, how have the various lenses that the government has put into the infrastructure bank what has the effect of those lenses been? When you look at a business model where they originally proposed was going to be that the bank was going to take on the risks of this financing, they're going to provide either reduced rates of borrowing or loan guarantees, that type of thing. You would imagine that the the corporations would be tripping over themselves to take that deal. That hey, if the government wants to assume all the risk, why not participate in this? And yet we just haven't seen that uptake. There only a handful of projects are even up on the government's website in terms of projects even at the conception stage. I've heard feedback from various stakeholders that in some cases it's the various lenses that have been applied to that skew and filter out some of the projects that could perhaps be undertaken, but they don't meet the current criteria of this government. Can you speak to that at all?
Mr. Bain?
Sure. My understanding was with the initial establishment of the CIB in 2017, that there was a very strict kind of filter and mandate around the projects and sectors that it could invest in. But over time, and specifically through the growth plan announcement in October 2020, that mandate has perhaps broadened a little bit. I would say, in many cases, the devil's in the detail here, because you've got a series of project commitments that the CIB's made that are really only commitments around memorandum of understanding. So it's very difficult at that stage to really assess the success and the specific model and financing approach of the CIB on the basis of an MOU. So, I think, again, you kind of go back to their ultimate measure at the end of the day is going to be the 2 times multiple of CIB capital. So to date, in the 10 or so projects that have been committed to, I don't see a measure of that 2 times multiple of the CIB commitment. But again, we have to recognize that these projects are in the sort of development stage, the MOU stage, and perhaps over time, those details will become apparent.
Mm. Well, hope springs eternal, I suppose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bain. We're now going to move on to our next questioner. We're going to have Mr. Rogers from the Liberal Party. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Very different perspectives on how we build infrastructure, I'm sure, coming from both sides. I know my involvement as well in the municipal sector. I saw many discussions at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities as a board member about P3 projects and versus public funds for building infrastructure across the country. And a couple of questions I have first of all, Mr. Bain, what do you see as the major barriers today in getting infrastructure projects financed or funded?
Mr. Bain?
I think it's as I alluded to in one of my recommendations at the federal level. I think it is really around having an entity, an agency mandated with the overall identification and coordination of major federal infrastructure projects. I think if you had that in place, that might generate significantly more opportunities than we're seeing today. It may also generate those types of opportunities that may lead directly to private sector investment in infrastructure. So it will actually help them meet that primary mandate of leveraging private sector capital. If you just look at several of the recent federal P3 or federal major infrastructure projects, whether the CSEC facility in 2010, RCMPE division headquarters in BC 2010, the Iqaluit International Airport 2013, Champlain Bridge 2015, Gordie Howe Bridge 2016. Each of those projects relies significantly on both federal and private sector finance and investment. I think the only one in that list that's really not truly a federal project, although the federal government provided significant financing to that project, is the Iqaluit Airport for obvious reasons.
Mr. Rogers?
Thank you, Mr. Bain. I guess the government of Canada is already investing in thousands of projects across the country, some large, some small, through investing in the Canada Infrastructure Plan. In your opinion, what creative ways are there to make the most out of the taxpayers' dollars? And Mr. Penner or Mr. Bain, I'd like for both of you to comment on that. And I think particularly of the part of the growth strategy, which is broadband. Broadband, which would not be happening in rural Newfoundland and Labrador and rural Canada without the support of the government of Canada. And that's why we've been investing major infrastructure dollars. Unlike Mr. Scheer, who wanted to cut $18 billion, we've decided to invest and support rural Canada. I'd like for both of you to comment on that for me, please.
We'll start off with Mr. Penner.
Well, I think the simple answer in terms of how to make the most of public funds for infrastructure spending is to stop engaging in P3s and privatization. As I outlined earlier, P3s and privatized projects cost billions of dollars more. So if you want to save money, stop doing.
Mr. Bain.
I would say on that point, I mean, I think the government has to reflect on its financial and fiscal position, particularly given the challenges that we've just faced in the last 11 months with COVID-19, and whether or not it has the capacity on its own to invest in and deliver the public infrastructure that the country requires, and that we are actually going to require in terms of improving long-term job prosperity, productivity, and growth in our economy. So I think there's a role for both. And I think given the situation we're in, the private sector investment is going to be extremely important. I think with respect to rural investment, absolutely critical, whether that's rural Newfoundland, whether it's rural Ontario, or whether it's in Canada's north. I mean, these are areas of the country that have, in many cases, faced underinvestment in infrastructure over the last, number of years, over the last decades, and I think addressing those deficiencies is critical moving forward.
Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, and the CIB has laid out several priority investment areas. So from your perspective, Mr. Penner or Mr. Bain, both, which areas do you think are most important and most promising when we look at transit, clean power, broadband, trade and transport, green infrastructure? What area do you consider to be the most important?
Mr. Rogers, was that for Mr. Bain or Mr. Penner?
Both.
Okay, well, I'll go to one, Mr. Bain, quickly, because we're out of time here.
Okay.
Sure. Quickly, I mean, if you're asking my personal opinion, I would advocate for trade and transportation, given its impact on the country's economy going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Mr. Rogers. We'll now move on to the block. Mr. Barceau-Duval. Mr. Barceau-Duval, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will go on with Mr. Bain. Earlier, Mr. Bain, you told us about your experience, your expertise in the P3s, and I understand that from your viewpoint, you find these very important, but is there a limit to the participation of the private sector in infrastructure projects? Are there certain projects in which the private sector should not be involved?
I'm just trying to digest the question and put together a response here. I mean, certainly in terms of the projects that I've been involved in, it's been key that the private sector has been responsible for the delivery, the construction, the financing, and the building management of the infrastructure. It has not moved into the operations of the public services that occur within those facilities. So I think that, from my personal perspective, that's an important delineation, whether it's a hospital P3, such as the BC Children and Women's Hospital, or whether it's a school in Saskatchewan or Alberta. We are not encroaching on the public services that are being delivered, rightly so, by the governments in those facilities.
Mais ma question, c'est savoir, est-ce qu'il y a une limite?
But my question was whether there are some projects in which the private sector is not relevant in terms of infrastructure.
it's a simple response of there's a certain class of projects that the private sector it's not appropriate for them to participate in. I think that was one of the reasons for the establishment of the CIB, to help support those projects that otherwise may not be supported by the private sector.
J'ai une dernière question pour vous.
I have one last question for you. Personally, how much money have you made from P3s in terms of profits?
How much have I personally made? I've personally made none, other than my salary.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. We're now going to move on to our next questioner. We have Mr. Bachrach from the NDP for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Mr. Penner. I think the conversation and where we all come together in agreement is that the objective when we build infrastructure is to maximize value for the Canadian people. And value can be measured many ways. A lot of this discussion has been on monetary value and trying to get the best bang for the buck, so to speak. But of course, there are many other things that we value, some of which are more difficult to put a price on. I wonder, Mr. Penner, if you could talk about the ability of P3s or the lack of ability of P3 projects to account for some of those non-monetary social, community, and environmental values that are also important when we look at the overall picture.
Mr. Penner?
Well, for me, in my primary area of work around the climate crisis, I think about this quite a bit because we've had decades of delay and inaction at the federal level when it comes to the climate crisis, and that happens in the context where the CIB is looking at P3s and privatization. When P3s and privatization, the projects that come along with that take so much longer at a time when the urgency of the climate crisis just doesn't allow us to take as long as we feel like we want to take. So we really need to be talking about the opportunity cost that and the opportunities lost by engaging in P3s for infrastructure instead of public financing as part of how we tackle the climate crisis.
Mr. Bachrach?
Mr. Penner, why do you think the current federal government is so preoccupied with attracting private capital and pursuing P3 projects as a way of delivering infrastructure?
Mr. Penner?
Well, I think it gets back to what I was talking about earlier for the general support for neoliberal economics. Privatization is part of that, but as is deregulation and free trade, and all of these together have led to the climate crisis, the economic inequality that we're facing, the inequalities in terms of racism and our various intersecting crises that we're facing. And I think we need to go down a very different road because we can't solve the problems we're facing with the same approaches that cause the problems that we're facing.
Thank you, Mr. Penner, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. We're now going to move on to the Conservatives. Mr. Soroka, you've got the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question is to Mr. Bain. During your presentation, you used the expression that the CIBC is crowding out opportunity. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Mr. Bain?
Sure. Thank you for the question. What I'm suggesting there is that there are, on its face, from my perspective, some commitments, or maybe more specifically, when you look at their corporate plan, Appendix I, where they lay out the models that they intend to invest in, they are clearly suggesting that they're going to invest in what we call DBFM, or Design, Build, Finance, Maintain, which is generally referred to as the P3 model. So they've specifically, have suggested that they would not be impacting or crowding out the investment that has traditionally gone into those models and those projects, but that's a clear suggestion that they are. The other project that I question myself is the GO expansion on corridor project, whereby, from my perspective, that project was proceeding under the Ontario government as a DBFM project, and only after the fact did the CIB appear to come in and commit to providing funding to that project. So that was an example to me of a project that was proceeding as a DBFM P3 project here in Ontario under the Infrastructure Ontario model, which I happen to be very familiar with, given that I was previously at Infrastructure Ontario, and again is an example of where perhaps the CIB didn't need to commit to that project to meet the objectives that it's laid out in its mandate.
Mr. Soroka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Bain again, I have to ask that question that underneath the CIB, that basically all the risk is removed for the contractor and it's all assumed by essentially the taxpayer then. So why has there not been so much private sector uptake on the CIB?
Mr. Bain.
I mean, at this juncture, I think it's as I previously responded. I think in some respects it's a little unfair to make that assertion or come to that conclusion at this point in time. Much of the projects that they've announced or committed to, as I've said, are in this sort of MOU or advisory phase. So it's unclear whether or to what degree those projects will eventually attract private sector capital. So I can't really speculate or judge.
If I could just interject there a bit, the fund has been operating for a few years already, and we're still at that phase where we're not committed to yet. That's why I'm kind of concerned that there hasn't been the uptake.
Mr. Bain.
Yeah, and again, like I say, I'm not sure it's an issue of uptake as much as it's an issue of the status or the stage that these projects are in, and how advanced the development of the projects are at this juncture.
Mr. Roca.
Okay, I'll jump to Mr. Penner for one question there. I have to ask, do you believe there is a single P3 project out there that would work or not?
Mr. Penner.
Well, you can cherry pick from any set of examples on any issue, but the evidence is clear that on the whole, that these projects cost more, deliver less, remove democratic control.
Okay, because I know myself, I'm a former mayor as well as like most people, and one of the things that we always tried to do was get P3s, but it was very unsuccessful. So we always tendered projects out, and yet the people would go and say to us, well, you should have partnered up because you could have got a better price for the project if you would have only done that. And you're saying that's completely false.
Mr. Penner.
I think the Auditor Generals in BC and Ontario have been clear on this point. The evidence is there.
Okay. To Mr. Bain, then, do you believe that the CIB will have any positive effects on helping bring back the economy in the COVID crisis that we're in?
Mr. Bain.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's insofar as it's able to advance and deliver infrastructure projects or have these projects advance to the market and built. It certainly will have an impact. I mean, it's about jobs. Obviously, how long these projects take to get to the point of shovel ready or shovels in the ground is an important consideration. But insofar as they do that, it's going to lead to jobs. It's going to lead to improved productivity and ultimately economic growth for the country. So it's critical in terms of those priorities and objectives.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Go ahead, Mr. Bain. Go ahead.
I think, again, the consideration is really around timing here, right? I think it's maybe a little bit naive to think that these major projects, given the stage that they're in, are going to have any immediate impact in 6 to 12 months. But if we're talking, 12 to 18 months, then in the medium term, I think that that's a reasonable assumption.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. And thank you, Mr. Soroka. We're now going to move on to the Liberals with Ms. Jacek. Ms. Jacek, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses. Certainly, you've given us a lot to think about. Mr. Bain, Mr. Penner seems to use P3s and privatization almost interchangeably. Is there anything that is in the Canada Infrastructure Bank that specifically mandates privatization in their pilot projects or the projects that are being proposed to date?
Mr. Bain?
From my review, and it was a fairly detailed review over the last number of days preparing for the committee, I've seen no reference or mention that the mandate of the CIB is privatization.
Jessica?
And in your experience, Mr. Bain, you mentioned a number of your P3s through Concert Infrastructure constructed schools in BC. Presumably, they're all in public ownership.
Mr. Bain?
Yes, just to correct you, not schools in BC, but 2 bundles of schools in Alberta, 2 bundles of schools in Saskatchewan, all publicly owned.
So how could one assure Mr. Penner that public ownership is maintained within the structure of P3s? Would it depend on the amount of capital from each party that would determine who has ownership? I mean, I've heard of some situations where there is some privatization originally, but reverts to public ownership after a number of years. So could you describe a number of different models?
Mr. Bain?
Sure. I think the majority of these P3 models in Canada are delivered on the basis of the various governments granting the private sector consortiums licenses to the sites and the facility to carry out the scope of work for which they're responsible for. So legal ownership of the land and of the buildings resides with the government, and that's clearly spelled out. The other consideration is, as I laid out previously, around where you delineate the scope and the responsibility within these facilities or the projects. And we are not, in any of the P3s that Concert Infrastructure is involved in, are not responsible for the delivery of public services. We're responsible for building, financing, and maintaining the facilities. The government retains, as I said, ownership of the land, the building, and responsibility for those critical public services that are supported by the P3 facilities.
Ms. Jessic?
The growth plan of the Canada Infrastructure Bank has specified broadband, some $2 billion. I'm on the Industry, Science and Technology Committee, and we've just concluded a study on the accessibility and affordability of broadband across Canada. And I think one thing that is so striking is that there are so many players involved in ensuring that the whole of Canada is connected, and particularly complex issues related to broadband in the north and rural areas. Do you think that the Canada Infrastructure Bank can play a significant role in bringing the parties together in order to ensure that projects get delivered?
Mr. Bain?
I would say at the outset, first, I'm not an expert in broadband, and it's not been a sector or a project focus of Concert to date. So really, I think you would have to look to somebody with a little bit more experience in that sector to respond to that question.
So perhaps I'll ask Mr. Penner if he has any insight into the delivery of broadband.
Mr. Penner?
I'm not an expert on broadband either, but it gets back to the general point of publicly built and operated projects being more cost effective and better for communities.
Well, it looks like our study is going to be very valuable, and then the one that we're doing at Industry, Science and Technology. There is at the Canada Infrastructure Bank something called the Accelerator Program. I'm wondering, Mr. Bain, if you've had a chance to study that. It seems to be an area where there is an intention to bring parties together. Does that sound like a reasonably good idea?
Mr. Bain?
Absolutely. I think the simple answer is yes. It's a good idea. It's about developing and advancing projects at an early stage, such that at some point they're actually viable and can be implemented or become shovel ready. And I think at this stage there's probably a couple that fall into that category. You have the new Westminster Rail Bridge in BC. And I would suggest probably the Via Rail, although it was committed before the project accelerator commitment, it kind of falls into that bucket as well. So it's really about early development of potential infrastructure projects that will have a significant impact on the communities that are involved.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Ms. Jacek. We're now going to move on to our third round, starting off with the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Mr. Scheer, you got the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, just wanted to go back to Mr. Bain. You spoke about the Go Transit project. Would it be a fair description? I don't want to lead the witness here, but the way you described it, it almost sounds like that this was backfilling a project that was already going ahead, that already was likely going to fit under current funding models, and then the announcement was made. So would you agree that that was almost replacing other streams of federal financing? And from your assessment, do you think that displaced potential private sector involvement in that project?
Mr. Bain?
Based upon the details that I've seen and the timing of commitments, and that's the conclusion I come to. There may be further details that suggest otherwise, but from my perspective, from others I know in the industry, that's certainly a perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I know Mr. Rogers made an accusation about the Conservative plan. I think it's important to highlight the fact that under existing Liberal programs, a significant percentage of project funding is being lapsed. They're very good at making the announcements, not so good at following through on it. I think the CIB is a perfect example of that. I mean, this wasn't just a pilot project that was developed. This wasn't just a trial run that they were going to see if they could incubate something and grow it up. This was a marquee announcement. This was the result of very high-level meetings. I mean, when you go back and you read the media reports about the inception of this bank, this was the cream of the cream. These are all the people that get invited to the World Economic Forum. These are people whose cufflinks cost more than my car probably, and they all got together and they convinced the Prime Minister that this was going to unleash an avalanche of private sector money into projects. So I understand from your perspective, there's been a couple of different resets. They've shuffled the deck chairs a couple of times with different personnel, and they have rejigged their mandate, and they have done almost a complete overhaul. So I understand where you might want to say, well, perhaps this will bear fruit, but I think given the fact that this wasn't just a trial run, this was supposed to be set up to accomplish a very measurable, as you said, you use the term 2 times investment, that the threshold for success, they said they were going to double the private sector investment in relation to public money. They haven't done that. So I understand where you might want to reserve judgment until this current plan, but would you say it's fair to say that up until this point, it's completely failed in its objectives?
Mr. Bain?
Sorry, I wouldn't necessarily conclude that it's failed in its objectives. Is it delayed in its objectives? I think that's probably fair. There are, as they lay out for themselves in their corporate plan, there are very kind of objective measures in terms of performance. And I think that it's important that government and Canadians hold the organization to account for its performance against those objectives. I think as I've also suggested, there is a gestation period for major infrastructure projects, and you just don't flip the switch on and suddenly they're shovel ready or the shovel's in the ground. These take time to plan and lay out and to procure, and so there is a reasonable period of time that one might assume that would take. If you look at other procurement agencies around the country, it certainly didn't take Partnerships BC or Infrastructure Ontario 3 years to advance major infrastructure projects to shovel ready.
Mr. Scheer?
Just very clear, you're saying it took less time or more time, just so I understand?
Sorry, it took less time.
Took less time. Okay, that's fair enough. And you are right. Nobody expects that announcements made and then within a week or two, something's up and operational. But I can certainly point to the P3 model that I'm most familiar with, and that is the overpasses built as part of the Regina bypass in my home riding. That was I've got the information here. The RFP, the request for proposals, was August 2014. The contract signed July 2015, and the first phase was completed in 2017. So that's 2 years from the contract being signed, and the full project was completed in 2019. So we're looking at a 4-year timeline from contract being signed to being completed, and we're coming up on the 4-year mark here, and there's no evidence that we're going to hit any of those project completions in the short term.
Thank you, Mr. Scheer. And thank you, Mr. Bain. We're now going to move on to Mr. Arcuri. Mr. Arcuri, for the Liberals, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to welcome our guests. My first question is for Mr. Penner. Mr. Penner, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is currently working hand in hand with the Quebec government to identify major infrastructure priorities, such as the REM, which will create quality jobs and which will contribute to reducing emissions. So what opportunities exist between the CIB and the Quebec group in order to help fight against the climate crisis?
Thanks for the question. Well, for those of us who are concerned about the climate crisis and acting urgently on it, I think the model that the CIB is engaging in is contradictory to those aims because of the increased costs, because of the likelihood that it will create less jobs, because of the length at which the projects continue on, and the I'll leave it at that for now.
Mr. Arcuri.
Merci.
Mr. Arcuri, my second question is for Mr. Bain. Mr. Bain, how can Canada attract more investment to launch more infrastructure projects during this time of economic crisis? And what could you tell us? Is it the right time to cut back on infrastructure budgets? As we've already heard from certain projects regarding cutbacks of some 19 billion and more. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think as I've laid out, investment in infrastructure is critical to a strong performing economy and economic growth, whether it's the jobs that it creates or it's the efficiency or productivity that results from that infrastructure. It's absolutely important, I think, at this stage to continue forward with those commitments. In respect of the question around attracting capital for investment, I think the point that I've been trying to make is there is plentiful Canadian capital ready and available to invest in Canadian infrastructure, whether that's capital that Concert brings through our 10 BC-based union and management pension plans, whether it's competitors, whether it's other Canadian pension plans. There is capital within the country to invest in our infrastructure, and it's proven and efficient capital.
Mr. Arcuri.
Mr. Dacoury, I have another question for Mr. Bain. Mr. Bain, it's clear that there's an infrastructure deficit in this country. Could you explain to us how we can begin to make up for that critical deficit? And what kind of infrastructure would require investment the most urgently at this time?
I think, I mean, again, we've touched on these issues in previous questions, but you know, my best suggestion around increasing infrastructure investment is to mandate the CIB to have a responsibility and leadership over the federal government's own infrastructure and capital projects or commitments that it's making within its own domain. To me, that's an immediate opportunity to advance and improve infrastructure delivery at the federal level. In terms of,
go ahead.
There was a second part to the question in terms of priorities. I mean, I think, you know, we could debate the priorities. I mean, the priority, you know, whether it's First Nations, whether it's green energy, whether it's trade and transportation, again, I think they all contribute to a more productive economy. They all contribute to job growth. I think it becomes a matter of kind of values and you know, preference more than anything. But given the infrastructure deficit that we do face in Canada, I mean, we have needs across all of those sectors.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Mr. Alcuri. We're now going to move on within this third round to our next speaker from the block, Mr. Barceau-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, ma question va être pour...
Mr. Chairman, my question is for Mr. Penner. I was reading through the annual report by Infrastructure Canada, and I was surprised as I read it, because there's mention of public money that is invested in the CIB, and just had been in the news when we heard that the former director of the Infrastructure Bank had left with a bonus, and the amount was not disclosed. Apparently, he was paid around $600,000 a year. But in its annual report, the CIB releases no information on salary, on compensation of directors, of the bonuses paid out. Don't you find that that's a little bit of a lack of transparency? And if I look at the annual report of a major private Canadian bank, the information is disclosed.
I haven't read that report myself, but that does sound troubling and just also sounds emblematic of the kind of lesser transparency we see when we go down the road of privatization and P3s, and that's one of the fundamental reasons to oppose them.
Mr. Barceau-Duval.
Merci, Monsieur Penner.
Mr. Duval, thank you, Mr. Penner. My next question is this. So we're hearing that companies would be interested in investing in infrastructure projects, but they're looking at returns between 7 and 8%. We understand that 7 to 8% is a very good return for any portfolio. But when we look to find investments on our side, usually these are lower returns. But the government lending rate is far below that. So how would the public's efficiency be enhanced? That is the so-called efficiency of the public. Would it offset the difference in return, whereas we often borrow at 1%, 2%, 3% rates? So there would be a major variance between the two. So how can we make this work for us then?
Mr. Barceau-Duval, was that question for Mr. Penner or Mr. Bain?
Ça pourrait aller aux deux, mais ça peut être Monsieur.
For both our witnesses, but it could be for Mr. Penner.
Yeah, I can start. I think that does get to a fundamental problem where the lower lending rates of the Canadian government don't necessarily mean that there is less efficiency. As I talked about earlier, these P3 projects actually take much longer and are therefore less efficient to do, and just highlights again why public financing is the better route to go.
Thank you, Mr. Penner. Mr. Bain, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I would just say that, you know, at this point in time, sure, the government can borrow at 1.5% or whatever rate, but that rate won't hold forever. So I think it's reasonable to assume that rate goes up. At the end of the day, this is about risk premium and the value, whether in cost, efficiency, or schedule that the private sector is able to deliver in respect of the infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Thank you, Mr. Penner, and thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. We're now going to move on to our next set of questions from the NDP. Mr. Bachrach, you have 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Penner, we had a really interesting question earlier from Ms. Jacek about projects that aren't necessarily fully P3 models, in that the ownership doesn't transfer over to the private sector. But we've seen lots of projects, schools are a good example, where they're set up using the P3 model somewhere along that spectrum. And I know the Auditors General have looked at the examples of schools that have been constructed as P3s. I wonder if you're familiar with some of those examples, and if you could talk about the pitfalls that they've experienced.
Yeah, just to give you a couple quick example, Nova Scotia reviewed 39 P3 schools in 2010, and that review revealed that, quote, the terms of service contracts are not adequate to ensure public interest is protected. So that they also claim there was no child abuse registry or criminal record check of subcontractors. So it just highlights, regardless what sector we're looking at, P3s are plagued with problems.
Mr. Bachrach? You're on mute, Taylor.
My sense of time, Mr. Chair. My apologies. This question about value for money, I find a very interesting one. And Mr. Barcelou-Duval's previous question about the fact that the government can access more affordable financing than the private sector can. And, you know, I often think of these questions in terms of how could I explain this to my 13-year-old daughter? I wonder, Mr. Bain, if you could explain why the government should use more expensive money to build these projects, because we clearly have, you know, Auditors General that say that these projects take longer and cost more. What is the core of the argument for the P3 model?
Mr. Bain?
Yeah, insofar as we have, you know, Auditors General that say, you know, it's more expensive, we have others that have proven out that it's more effective and efficient. I think, again, it's really around the risk premium and assumptions that that governments make around the risk of delivering these projects, whether it's delay in development of the projects, delay in approvals of the projects, whether it's risks of construction delay that they would assume under a traditional model of delivery. When you account for those in the P3 model, that represents the transferred risk, and that represents the premium that you are presumably paying for the infrastructure.
Now you're on mute, Mr. Chair, so I'm going to go wild here and just say to Mr. Bain that that is exactly what I think a lot of people have trouble understanding, is this concept of a risk premium.
Thank you,
when
Mr.
we have
Bachrach.
the Auditors General saying that these projects take longer and cost more, that explanation needs to be unpacked significantly.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach.
Chair. Back to
Took
you.
full advantage of that one, didn't you? We're now going to thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Thank you, Mr. Penner and Mr. Bain. We're now going to move on to our next set of questions from the Conservative Party. We have Mr. Cram. Mr. Cram, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. My questions are for Mr. Bain of Concert Infrastructure. I think it's important for people to understand that P3s are not just a catchphrase. Public-Private Partnerships Canada used to be an actual federal government crown corporation. It was wound down a few years ago and more or less replaced by the Canada Infrastructure Bank. From the perspective of Concert Infrastructure's day-to-day operations, can you speak to some of the key differences between the old Public-Private Partnerships Crown Corporation and the new Canada Infrastructure Bank?
Mr. Bain?
Sure. I think, I mean, the most obvious difference is the P3 assessment screen, which I've referred to previously. P3 Canada, or PPP Canada, had that screen in place prior to 2015 for any federal infrastructure project investment that was greater than $100 million. And so those potential projects had to be screened for delivery by through the P3 model. And as I've laid out, it led to the 5 federal projects that I've referenced previously. And by my count, at least 13 major municipal infrastructure projects, such as the Regina Wastewater Treatment Center, the Regina Bypass, the Saskatoon Civic Ops Center, among others. So that screen, to me, if your objective is to leverage private sector investment, that screen was pretty successful in doing that.
Mr. Graham.
And can you speak to what that screen's implications are to project timelines?
Mr. Bain.
I wasn't personally involved in applying the screen and how that worked, so I don't think I could specifically comment on what the impact to timelines would be.
Mr. Graham.
Okay, fair enough. I've been to Concert Infrastructure's website, and your organization has had a great deal of experience with building housing infrastructure. I would imagine that if your organization wants to build a housing project, it must be a tremendous amount of work to coordinate with the provincial governments of BC or Ontario or with different municipalities. From your perspective and from the perspective of Concert Infrastructure, what can be done to streamline government processes and get housing projects and other projects built faster and better and quicker?
Mr. Bain.
Great question. Just to be clear, Concert, there are two separate organizations. One is Concert Realty Corporation. The other is Concert Infrastructure. I am responsible for the leadership of Concert Infrastructure, so I don't have direct involvement in the real estate company and those projects. But having said that, certainly whether it's affordable housing, whether it's transit-oriented development opportunities in Toronto or Vancouver as an example, certainly there is an intersection of infrastructure and real estate. And I think, what's probably critical in these types of projects and opportunities, as specifically transit-oriented development, where the government of Ontario is trying to deliver a significant subway program, but also realize value in the delivery of infrastructure the delivery of real estate or condominiums over top of subway stations, where the development approval is the responsibility of the municipalities. There needs to certainly be stronger coordination and alignment amongst the levels of government as to the overall objectives of these projects and opportunities, because there is a direct conflict in terms of what the municipality wants to see delivered versus, say, the province or the federal government potentially. So, approvals and development coordination is critical.
Mr. Graham.
Right. And with respect to your second recommendation from your opening statement, that the Canada Infrastructure Bank should take a leadership role in identifying infrastructure projects, it would seem to me that infrastructure projects should be driven from the bottom up and not the top down. If the Canada Infrastructure Bank were to take more of a leadership role, can you speak to some of the best practices that should be in place to make sure that local stakeholder interests are still heard and that we don't get into an Ottawa knows best approach?
Mr. Bain.
Sure. I think the one of the key distinctions to draw here is that in each of the projects that the CIB has committed to, they are not ultimately responsible for the construction, the procurement, the construction, the delivery of that infrastructure. They are strictly providing funding and financing to those projects, and in some cases, advisory support. What I'm advocating with my second recommendation is that the CIB be given a leadership role in terms of the federal government's own infrastructure. Again, whether that is RCMP detachments, whether that is First Nations housing or other building infrastructure, there's a huge portfolio of federal infrastructure that goes uncoordinated and is the responsibility of each individual department to see delivered. And I question whether that's the most efficient, effective way to deliver that infrastructure. And I question whether that way of delivering federal infrastructure actually leverages the opportunity for private sector investment.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Thank you, Mr. Cram. Well done. We're now going to move on to the Liberals for 5 minutes. Mr. Fillmore, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for their testimony tonight. Just off the top, I want to just sort of clarify, look, P3s, the timelines of projects of this scale, Mr. Bain is quite right. They're enormous projects with very long planning horizons and construction horizons. I worked on the Boston's Big Dig project as a city planner many years ago, and that was a project fully 30 years in its from inception to completion. So we have to allow these projects to take the time that they need. And I would also say that P3 agreements, asking whether a P3 agreement is good is like asking how long is a piece of string, really. It's all about the way that they're crafted. And I think early on in the P3 experience, there were some that were crafted less well than others, and now they're quite sophisticated in protecting the public interest. But what I want to say is this government is involved in a $180 billion infrastructure investment program that is based on cost sharing with provinces and municipalities. But we know that cost sharing is not always within reach for municipalities and organizations that need infrastructure built, especially now in the time of a pandemic where municipalities have been impoverished. So more than ever, the additional $35 billion from the infrastructure bank is important. I just want to say, just today, I spoke to a rural transit provider. I spoke to a company that is interested in clean power in the north, and I spoke to the Canadian Nurses Association, who is interested in broadband across the country for telehealth so that everybody can access it. And in each of those three cases, okay, transit for people who need help getting around, clean power in the north, and telehealth, there is not sufficient money available to build those things without things like the infrastructure bank, without this kind of. So, Mr. Penner, when I look at your bio, you ask a couple of questions there. You say, if you're fighting for a livable climate, if you're fighting for a just transition, if you're fighting for Indigenous rights, well, that's exactly what we're doing here. We are making vast sums of money available so that people can get the infrastructure in the communities that they need at a time in a pandemic when municipalities are impoverished, projects that otherwise will go undone, So it seems to me like you have taken a position of agreeing with Mr. Scheer's position, which is that we should be slashing about $18 billion from our infrastructure program at a time when Canadians need it most. So my question is for Mr. Bain. Mr. Bain, with the pandemic, with municipalities impoverished, with the climate emergency, does this seem like the right time to be talking about removing funding from communities through infrastructure investment?
Mr. Bain?
I think, as I laid out in my opening comments, certainly from Concert Infrastructure's perspective, investment in infrastructure is critical and important. So I think I did state that we certainly support the government's $180 billion commitment. I think you're right to point out, today we're really talking about $35 billion of that commitment, which is specifically focused around the CIB. That leaves a significant chunk of change that will support more traditional infrastructure investment, including smaller projects that you've referenced. As I've laid out a number of times, I think infrastructure as a stimulus, in the short term is a challenge. It's delivery of our infrastructure is not fast, it's not cheap, but it's powerful, and it's powerful in the sort of the medium term with respect to supporting economic growth, creating jobs, enhancing our productivity, and ultimately providing the core public services that are supported by those buildings or the infrastructure that we are able to deliver.
Mr. Fillmore?
And Mr. Bain, do you have any advice for committee members on any changes perhaps or improvements or mechanisms that the CIB should put in place or should have in place to ensure that the public interest is protected? I was talking about how sophisticated P3 agreements are now compared to what they used to be. Any advice for how we can make sure that taxpayers' interests are protected?
Mr. Bain?
Sure. I think, again, you have to recognize my earlier comment around the fact that the CIB itself is not ultimately responsible for the delivery of these projects, right? They're relying on their partners, whether they be provincial or municipal, for the actual procurement and delivery of the project. So presumably it's those entities that are ultimately responsible for the contracts and the project documents. But having said that, I mean, there's lots of examples. As you have alluded to, we're now probably within Canada 20 years on from the Nova Scotia P3 schools, and we've certainly advanced our thinking, our approaches, and our contracts. But having said that, I mean, you could look to the government of British Columbia today that is, ensuring that there's community benefits agreements and provisions included in their infrastructure contracts. So absolutely, it's a matter of priority and interest in terms of what those protections are that you're seeking. But there are certainly mechanisms available, and there's lots of precedent for ensuring that the public interest is ultimately protected through the delivery of these projects.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. We're now going to move on to our fourth round, starting off with the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Mr. Scheer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's the second time I've heard a Liberal try to make this point. Just for the record, it's the current Liberal government that has seen billions of dollars in lapse. I know they like to make accusation of cuts, but it's our party that has a record of delivering on infrastructure. The current government has allowed billions of dollars worth of infrastructure spending to lapse. That means to not be spent. And I think the Infrastructure Bank is the perfect example of that, because it was launched with $35 billion and it's completed 0 projects. So I think that's the context in which this study is being conducted. The study is supposed to get at the root of what the problem is. Why has this bank proven to be so ineffective, and what we can do to advise the government. So just for any viewers watching this, or Canadians at home who are tuning into this, it's very important to understand that from internal audits at the Department of Infrastructure to the Parliamentary Budget Officer to soon an Auditor General's report, it's the current programs that have been so difficult, have been so incapable of getting money out the door and projects built. So I want to go back to something Mr. Penner has repeatedly said. Just want to ask him, in his opinion, are there ever examples of government wasting money?
Mr. Penner? Mr. Penner, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was saying I think it gets back to community needs and accountability, and it's not just about the financing, but whether people in communities have recourse to the projects that affect their lives. And if you look at the transit example that was raised earlier, entire communities in the West have been abandoned by Greyhound and the Saskatchewan Transportation Corporation shutting down operations because, as they claimed, they were no longer profitable. So they've entirely lost access to those services, which is a critically important point, that people need access to these services, and to do so, they need to be public.
So I'm sure we can both agree that governments have limited resources. Would you agree with that?
Mr. Penner?
Well, I think what the pandemic has made clear is that the federal government is in a position and has spent a fair amount on urgent needs. But what is partly...
But it's not infinite. It's not infinite, right? Like there isn't I've checked, believe me, I've checked. There's no money tree behind the Parliament buildings that you can just shake every time you need some money. Would you agree that there is a limit to the resources in any given fiscal year? We can have a debate about what that limit might be, but it's not infinite, right?
Well, regardless, there is a question of what's a wise investment and what's not, and the evidence is that P3s are not.
So, but my question though is, can you think? Do you believe that there are examples where government has wasted money?
Mr. Penner?
Well, I'm sure that there are, and the point being that if it's a public program, then governments can be held to account, but there's far less mechanisms to do so with private corporations.
Well, I'm glad that you agree, that because I've listened to your testimony, and I think you have this this faith in government, that government is always and everywhere capable of doing anything better than anybody else. And I think the record, if you look at various departments, you look at Auditor General's report, you look at parliamentary budget reports, you look at internal audits, there's a lot of things that government doesn't do very well. And so I'm glad we can agree that governments waste money. Do you believe that government can provide inferior services? Do you think all governments everywhere provide better services? There are never any shortfalls in terms of what a government aims to deliver and the outcome of that program.
Mr. Penner?
Well, I think one good example of that is when the previous Conservative government cut protections for water across the country, and that's just one example where.
Are you referring to the Navigable Waters Act?
Yes.
Are you referring to the fact that in the Navigable Waters Act there were all kinds of environmental issues that we ensured, that when you're talking about navigable waters, it actually referred to rivers that you could actually navigate? Because I do remember that debate where the Navigable Waters Act was applied to many different types of bodies of water. I've got examples. If you ever come to the wonderful riding of Regina Capel, I can show you spring runoff creeks that were subject to the Navigable Waters Act, where there was no ability to ever navigate those bodies of water. We made sure that they were adequately and forcefully protected in terms of environmental and watershed regulations. But surely we can agree that if you can't actually navigate through a body of water, that it might not belong under the Navigable Waters Act.
Well, I think it's a bit of an absurd claim that cutting protection to 99% of waterways in Canada is protecting
It's not environmental protection. We're talking about navigation. We're talking about whether or not in, say, one of the creeks that run through the Capel Valley, if you can't navigate a barge through or a vessel, that maybe the protections that should. And what we did do in terms of raising water quality standards, ensuring that municipalities were held to a higher account in terms of what they emitted into bodies of water. That's where we focused our attention, making sure that the environmental regulations actually improve the quality of water and the protection of our watershed.
Well, perhaps if your definition of protecting them is protecting the rights of fossil fuel companies to pass pipelines through as many waterways as possible, then yes.
There aren't too many. There aren't too many ocean tankers going through the Capel Valley.
We're now going to move on to our next speaker for 5 minutes to the Liberals. We're going to move on to Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a couple more questions. But first, before I get to the question, let me allow me to quote Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, who called the bank's recent irrigation investment in Alberta, and I quote, "a great expression of confidence in the future of agriculture and indeed Alberta's future. It's the first project developed under the Canada Infrastructure Bank's recently announced $10 billion growth plan, and we are proud to be the first project out of the gate." Here's what else Premier Kennedy said. With its new capital investment, it's not just good for jobs and the economy, and not just good for farmers and food processors. It's also good for the environment because we're going to be taking open air irrigation canals and burying them in pipes that will improve water retention and conservation. Just want to remind Mr. Scheer about the first project that the Premier Jason Kennedy is applauding. The question for Mr. Bain I have is, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all sectors of the economy. In response, the Minister of Infrastructure created COVID-19 resiliency stream, which is already creating hundreds of jobs and supporting critical projects, such as hospitals and schools, which are normally provincial in nature. So, Mr. Bain, can you speak to ways in which the Canada Infrastructure Bank can help create even more good-paying union jobs during the economic recovery? And Mr. Penner can follow up with a comment afterwards if he wishes.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a very simple answer. Advance projects such that they're shovel ready. As soon as they're shovel ready, that is how you are going to generate the jobs and employment that the infrastructure can support. I think you're absolutely right as we move forward. And I think as I've said, assume if we're talking about a COVID-19 fund that's outside the CIB mandate, I think perhaps that can be delivered and result in those funds moving into the economy or moving to municipalities or provinces much quicker than the 10 or so major projects that we're talking about here with respect to the CIB. But as I've spoken to earlier this afternoon, these projects, if advanced to the procurement and the delivery phase, will absolutely have a material impact on jobs in the economy and the productivity of our economy moving forward.
Mr.
I
Penner?
mean, as we are today, I mean, you've got the Canadian Building Trades Union, I think as recently as today in the Globe and Mail, indicating that their construction jobs are currently down about 10% compared to before COVID. Now that varies depending on what jurisdiction you're in. I think if you're in Alberta or Newfoundland, you're obviously seeing the trades and construction work more adversely impacted as a result of the oil and gas downturn, and maybe less so in some other jurisdictions. But as of today, the building trades themselves are saying they're about 10% off of pre-COVID employment.
Penner?
Yeah, I think a bigger part of the conversation as well in terms of building a just recovery is while there is an infrastructure deficit and there is a need for significant public infrastructure expansion, there is a serious operational crisis. If you look at things like public transit, for example, right now, where there's a need for at least $400 million per month that is being identified in terms of supporting operational expenses at the moment, so that passengers and riders can safely social distance and so on in the middle of this pandemic. So we need to be looking at that bigger picture as well.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes, thanks, Chair. Mr. Bain, I'm curious. You referenced a project that took place in Saskatchewan, I believe, with the building of 18 schools, and I just wonder, was that a project which was focused on just raising capital to build these schools, and then the province operated, or are these schools being operated by private sector?
I'm very familiar with the project since we delivered it. The project involved the design, build or construction, finance, and building maintenance and life cycle of the 18 schools. It's actually 9 facilities with 2 schools per facility. The Saskatchewan model is quite unique in that it brings the public system alongside the Catholic system to deliver education in a joint use facility. As I laid out, I think previously, the delineation of responsibility is really around concert infrastructure and our partners making those schools available to the government standard and requirements for the education to take place in those schools, as well as the building maintenance and life cycle. So we're responsible for maintaining the HVAC system, the landscaping, the grounds around the school, but we have no responsibility for the delivery of education within those facilities, as well as we do not have responsibility for the traditional caretaker or janitorial services that are provided in these public facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Bain, and thank you, Mr. Rogers. We're now going to move on to the block. Mr. Barcelona-Val, you have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Pender, earlier, Mr. Baines, in his opening remarks, referred more or less or suggested, in fact, that it might be a good thing if the CIB played a leadership role, that it should at the very least advise the government on how to manage our infrastructures rather than just waiting for the projects to land on their desks passively. They should be more proactive. Do you think that's a good idea?
Mr. Penner?
Well, I think it depends on a few considerations, but fundamentally it gets back to whether or not the CIB's mandate is one of expanding privatization and P3 projects, or whether it's a mandate for expansion of public infrastructure. I think it could play a positive role if it is focused on public infrastructure, but if it continues to be focused on private, it undermines the needs of people in communities.
Well, that's exactly what I was concerned about, because what we're seeing is that this CIB seems to have a mandate of privatizing infrastructures. So isn't this kind of a Trojan horse to have a federal infrastructure bank whose mandate is to look for opportunities to privatize infrastructure and, in fact, go even further than waiting for projects to come to it?
Mr. Benner?
That's definitely a concern, and it gets back to questions of community accountability as well, and if and when the various problems that have plagued P3s and continue to plague them arise in other projects, there is no recourse for local communities in the same way they have in terms of holding governments at all levels accountable. These are projects that are operated by private consortiums that can basically ignore public criticism, including from local city councils.
Peut-être pour Monsieur.
Perhaps a question for Mr. Bain. Earlier, I put a question to Mr. Penner regarding the compensation policies and the lack of transparency at the CIB. So I'd like to hear you speak to this. How do you see that? And what about the private sector? Will it ensure that public money is managed transparently and with accountability?
Thanks for the question. I think I'm kind of drawing back on my formal education in public administration, as well as having worked for the government. I think I would always err or advocate for greater transparency, not less, in any of the activities of government or a government agency. So I would certainly advocate and support full transparency on the agreements and the business of government, including its agencies such as CIB.
Thank you, Mr. Breslow-Duval, and thank you, members. I guess you guys caught me calling my wife here during the meeting here. Sorry about that. Anyways, I'll move on now to Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple final questions for Mr. Penner. We've talked a little bit about the Auditors General and the reports reporting their concerns about P3s, and I wonder if you can talk specifically about the ways in which the CIB's projects are likely to replicate those flaws.
Mr. Penner?
Come on.
Yeah, well, I think it gets back to the nature of P3s. If we have this body of evidence that we've seen from the Auditors General that existing P3s have had these problems, for example, in terms of the cost overruns, then the evidence tells us that future P3s are going to have the same problems that we've seen with the current and previous P3s. I think the evidence speaks for itself.
Mr. Penner, the minister often says that we aren't going to be able to address Canada's infrastructure needs without bringing in private capital, and this is something that we heard today from Mr. Fillmore as well. Do you think this assertion is accurate?
No, I don't. I think it gets. I don't think it's accurate. I think it gets back to if we genuinely want to see new infrastructure, and there are all these problems with P3s in terms of lack of democratic oversight, in terms of cost overruns, and in terms of delivering less, then why would we not go for the route of public infrastructure where we don't see the kind of serious level of problems. And it gets back to, the claim that maybe there are some privately funded infrastructure projects that have worked, but I think the reality is that if a clock is right twice a day, that doesn't mean that it works.
The chair's on mute, so I'll ask my last question. What ways would you improve the Canada Infrastructure Bank? Like, assuming that there is some potential in this mechanism, how would you salvage it if you were tasked with doing so?
Mr. Penner?
Well, I think there is still potential. I think it gets back to fundamentally the key thing is returning its mandate to focusing on publicly financed projects and moving away from and ruling out privatization and P3s. That's really what's going to be in the public interest. It's going to be much more responsive and accountable to local governments, and the timelines will be better, and we won't see the same kind of cost overruns, which means that there's more money available for other projects.
Thank you, Mr. Penner, and thank you, Mr. Backrack. And to members, I want to thank you for a very good meeting. Went very well, and to the witnesses as well. I want to thank you, as your contributions will no doubt be included in the final report that will be presented to members of the committee. So with that, members of the committee, I will now adjourn this meeting. Have a wonderful evening.